Prioritization is hard, and there is nothing worse than doing a ton of work but not moving the needle. I want to tell you how factories and the theory of constraints can show you precisely where to focus. I'll even tell you about a game that'll make you better at prioritization, and all this pulling from this book right here. Let's dive into it. I'm Bryce York, an Australian product leader based right here in New York City. After a decade in early and growth stage startups, including founding and exiting 3 of my own, I want to share more of my lessons learned in videos just like this one. In this video, I'm covering my #1 takeaway from this book right here. This book is so full of value that I can actually make this whole video covering only a quarter of the content. This book was written by Maurya, which I actually learned wasn't pronounced Maurya years after reading it when we connected with him to include some of his content in my enterprise startup, Radframe. The idea of the theory of constraints was originally introduced in the book by Eli Goldratt in 1984 called The Goal. There's a whole system and you can really dive into it, but we don't need all of that in order to apply the mental model into software product management. The idea of theory of constraints comes from physical factories. We want to think about our product like a factory that's producing an outcome instead of an output. We can apply this to both features and products if you're thinking about it in terms of jobs to be done. Thinking about a factory, let's think about this right here. Factory making microphone arms. So that's going to be a linear factory which goes through multiple steps, 6 in fact. First one is making the arms, cutting them to size. Then they're going to add in the joints so that the pieces will go together. Then they're actually going to join 2 of the arms together to make the full length. Then they're going to add the mount, which we use to bolt it onto the desk. So the outcome for this factory is the number of arms made per hour. That's the metric that we use to measure the success of our factory. In order to think about the theory of constraints, let's think about a hypothetical. What happens if the mount team, that 4th step in the process, what if their tools break and they just can't assemble any more of those mounts? They can't put them together. What's going to happen? Should be pretty intuitive, right? The factory stops. The arms per hour, our metric, is going to plummet. It's going to go way down. The arms missing mounts are going to start piling up next to that station. You're going to be able to see that collection of arms as everybody else keeps doing their job and keeps passing work in progress through the system. Now, obviously, the only way to improve this metric is to get that team, the mounts team, back up and running efficiently. Speeding up the arm machines, adding more people to quality control, adding more people to the packaging team isn't going to do anything to get the factory back on track if there's nobody there that is able to assemble mounts. When you think about an example like this, where one part of the system has just ground to a complete halt, it's really obvious. But when the system is still working and things are going through the factory, it can be very tempting to apply energy to improve parts of the system that aren't actually slowing it down, that aren't impacting that key outcome that is most important at what we're trying to drive for. In product, it's exactly the same, but it's easy to forget because our products don't look like a factory. We can't physically see the work in progress piling up. We can't see it holding us back. Now, this applies to the actual work, creating tickets, shipping software, but more importantly, it applies to the user experience, the achieving jobs to be done, and what that means for your business. If that's more users signing up and registering, going through the activation process, enabling that first feature and generating that value, which drives your outcome, which is happy customers, what's the part that's slowing that down? Don't focus your energy on something that's not actually constraining the system. If we want to increase our outcome metric, the only way to do that is by working on the constraint. So we have to focus our energy there. That's how we should be prioritizing. So the key thing to keep in mind is the idea of the mythical man month. You can't take 20 people and do the same work in 1/20th of the time. That never applies, and it starts to kick in pretty quickly. You don't want to be applying all of your resources to the single thing you're doing to improve the single constraint. You can have one constraint depending on how far you zoom in versus how far you zoom out, and you can be doing multiple things, testing multiple hypotheses about how you're going to improve that constraint, release that constraint, and in turn drive your overarching KPI or key result. What makes this such a powerful mental model is that it's really tangible. It's grounded in the real world. You can visualize it. You can see it in your head. In fact, it actually reminds me of a time back when I was like quite a bit younger, when I was sitting on the deck at my grandparents' place. They had a farm that I used to go to in school holidays. And my grandfather was explaining Newton's laws of physics. And I really just wasn't getting it. And so he actually grabbed a nearby pair of boots that were sitting on the ground, and he was explaining the concept that a body at rest remains at rest. And he said, if I put this shoe here on the ground and I do nothing, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to stay there. It's not going to go anywhere. Okay. And then what happens if I drop this shoe and there was nothing underneath it? What would happen? A body in motion remains in motion. And then what happens if I throw another shoe at this shoe that's sitting on the ground? It was at rest, but what happens when I hit it with the other shoe? Well, then it's going to move. And he said that this is how you can think about the framework of a body at rest remains at rest. The shoe just sits there. If you don't do anything, it's going to keep sitting there. A body in motion remains in motion. If the shoe is moving and it doesn't hit anything and nothing hits it, it's just going to keep moving. And both of these apply unless acted upon by an outside force. I still vividly remember this today, decades later. And that's the power of a tangible, physical mental model. Earlier on, I mentioned that there's a great game that can put all of this into practice. It doesn't technically make you better at prioritization, but it does make you better at thinking in constraints. It's a game called Factorio. You're building a factory to make a spaceship after you got stranded on a planet. Fair warning though, it's addictive. A buddy of mine that I used to work with actually has over 9,000 hours played. Toby Luke, the founder of Shopify, gives a free copy to every employee because he actually sees the lessons that learn from that translating directly into improving the company. You can actually see that idea we're talking about here of things building up and that piling up of resources in front of that constraint as that visual way to identify what's going on. You can see that when you've got a factory that's too slow, that you start to see this buildup of stuff on the conveyor belt. And that's the same thing, theory of constraints. That's your constraint in the system. So if you want to build things faster, that's the way to do it. Next time you're thinking about what to work on, look for the constraint in the system. Thanks for tuning in. And if you like this video and want to learn more about product management, you know the drill. Like the video and subscribe.